To get started here. My name is Catherine Periel, or Kat Periel. I am a criminal justice organizer here with the ACLU, and I will be welcoming and introducing our guests this evening. So first, we have State Representative Fentrice Driskell, represents District 63 in Hillsborough County. She is also the House Democratic Policy Chair. She was first elected, to office in 2018 and is currently in line to be the House Democratic Party leader in 2024. She's a graduate of Harvard University, where she was the first African American elected president of the student body. Representative Driskell went on to attend Georgetown Law School and is a partner at the Carlton Fields Law Firm. In 2021 legislative session, Driskell helped hammer out a bipartisan police reform bill that, among other things, mandates a duty to intervene if another officer is doing something wrong. It requires more transparency in use of force incidents and sets a minimum age for arrest. And so we're so excited to have her here this evening for this conversation. We also have State Senator Bobby Powell, who represents District 30 in Palm Beach County. He is the current Speaker pro tempore of the Florida Senate and the alternating chair of the Senate Joint Committee on Public Counsel Oversight. Senator Powell was elected to the Senate in 2016 after serving as a state representative from 2012 to 2016. Senator Powell attended Florida A&M University and went on to receive his master's from Florida State University. He was elected as chairman of the Florida Black Legislative Caucus in 2020, and Senator Powell has sponsored legislation that would limit the direct filing of children into the adult justice system and outlaw slavery in Florida. And moderating this evening, we have Kara Gross from the ACLU of Florida. And with that, I will return in the last 10 minutes with any questions from the audience, and I will pass it now to Kara, who will moderate this evening. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kat. And thank you so much, Senator Powell and Representative Driskell, for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you here. And I know you both, but hearing your bios just makes me, just so excited all over again that you're here joining us tonight. So thank you so much. We wanted to have this time to talk with you about a couple of really important issues, one of them being police reform in Florida's legislature. As everybody knows, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and so many others at the hands of police, there's been national attention about the need for police reform. We've seen reforms across the country, and there's been an outpouring of support and advocacy for police reforms here in Florida. So in your view, I'm going to ask both of you, what are the three most pressing police reform efforts that we need in Florida today, and why?
Okay, well, I'll give it a start. Thank you for having us so much. It's very great to be with the ACLU. Thank you for the partners that you are in the process and just for the perspective that you provide as we try to move forward on many different fronts with legislation to try to make things more equitable for all Floridians. So when it comes to police reform, and I know we'll have conversation more about House Bill 7051 and what it does as we go on. But I'll just tell you, part of the need that we saw when we were advocating for this bill was the lack of accountability, or feeling like there was that lack of accountability and transparency between the law enforcement community and communities of color. So you referenced, Kara, what happened with George Floyd, right? And it's George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I mean, take it back to Trayvon, take it back to Eric Garner. I mean, just so many unarmed Black people killed in this country, some at the hands of law enforcement, some not. But it certainly was giving this impression that there's not the level of accountability and transparency that we need to see. So one of the most important things that I think that the bill does is address that with the duty to intervene. So there's a lot of changes that it makes with respect to basic training. And so now officers in Florida are going to be trained, like you mentioned, that if they see another officer misbehaving, or maybe have their knee on the neck of someone for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, that they can't do that. They have to intervene. The other one that I think is really critical is the duty to render medical assistance, so that if there's somebody that's in custody and they're saying that they need help or they appear to need help, now the officers will be trained to have to do that. And then I know we'll probably have conversation based on, also on some things that were not in the bill, some reforms that we still want to see. And I'll just go ahead and toss out a thought that I have about that, which is respect to body cameras, because we know that body cameras are a key tool in providing that sort of transparency and accountability. It's both good for the community, but also good for our law enforcement officers. And by the way, we know that our officers, most of them are going out, just trying to do their job. They want to do right by the communities. They defend us even when they may not always agree with the protests that they're encountering. Most officers are doing a good job, and we know that our police chiefs and our sheriffs want to promote good policing. So body cameras serve a dual role in that they help provide that accountability piece that the community wants to see, but it also helps law enforcement be able to protect themselves and show the community what happens in particular incidents.
And I agree with Representative Driskell. Were those all three of yours, Rep?
Say what? What'd you say?
I said, are you finished? Did you do all three of yours?
Yes, I paused. It's all you.
Okay. I want to agree with Representative Driskell, especially when it comes to body cameras. That's so important for our police officers to protect not only themselves, but to protect the people who they are charged with protecting and serving. I really, really feel strongly about that. And I know that we at the state level have to make sure that we provide the funding to make sure it's not only necessary, but it's cost allowable here to make sure we have those body cameras. The other thing is, what always sticks with me is this idea of mental health. We had a panel in the Senate committee last week, Senate Criminal Justice Committee, and we started talking about mental health. And that is so important. We, in 7051, we put a piece of legislation in, which was originally one of my bills that was wrapped up in our package that allows for a part of the officers' continued learning to be credits related to mental health training and mental illness training to help identify someone who's suffering from mental illness. But also we need to make sure we're concerned about the mental health and mental illness or mental wellness of our officers. Trauma changes the formulas in your brain, right? We can go in as a police officer, and remember, sometimes people are go through the academy very young, 19 years old. And one of the things that was said on our panel is, remember, 19 years old, the brain is not fully formed. So you're still going through things. You're still trying to learn how to handle and deal with situations. And at 19, some of our officers end up walking on the scene of a homicide, maybe a child that's been murdered, dealing with issues where people have been raped and all types of issues that our officers are dealing with that the rest of us don't. That type of trauma changes the, I'm trying to say, it changes what's going on mentally in your head. Now, you pass psychological evaluations to become a police officer. And of course, sometimes you still get continued testing, but there needs to be treatment. There needs to be therapies. There's no reason why we're not taking care of our police officers when we know after some of them leave the force or even active duty, they're having the number of suicides that they're having, the number of suicides eclipsing the number of officers who were killed in the line of duty, and not just in the line of duty, but while on duty, dealing with things from everything from traffic crashes to heart attacks. You have more suicides than active police officers dying while being active. So you really need to really consider that in terms of health and mental health. Another thing I'd like to press that is not in the bill, not in our bill, is this idea of community policing. It's very difficult for us as a society to even get to know each other, right? We live right next door to each other, but we've got these phones, we've got social media, we've got video games. So we are not as connected as we once were. And we would like for our police officers to be more connected with us as a community. But what has to happen is, we know there are separations amongst people, but we have to figure out ways that we can be in the same area, in the same environment, without trying to do harm or feeling that there is animosity or some type of barriers between getting to know each other. Because a lot of the people who I know who are police officers, some of them are my family, some of them are people who I went to school with, people who I grew up with, and some of them are people that I've met just through this process. And for the most part, most of the police officers who I've met and I know personally are good people. But you don't run, a lot of times you don't run into the good people you know, and that could change your perception of everyone. So we have to figure out better ways to community police, but still keeping in mind that the police are there to protect and serve. And when things happen, we do want them to be able to handle business, but sometimes a police officer who knows a person can easily de-escalate a situation by going, hey, I know you know better than that. And I've seen it happen.
Thank you. Absolutely. Those are definitely things that we need here in Florida. And we'll talk throughout this session about the likelihood of those things actually moving this session as well. But let's talk about some of the successes that we've had. Rep. Driskell, you mentioned HB 7051 from last session. Somehow you were able to miraculously and successfully work this through our legislative process, this police reform bill that addressed many of the issues that we've spoken about. Can you walk us through the bill? I know you've mentioned some of the stuff that it had in there, but maybe just kind of expand on that a little bit. And tell us how that happened. How was this able to come about in Florida?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Well, let's start with the how first. So when we completed the 2020 legislative session, we rolled right into lockdowns and the pandemic. And usually we would take some time off. Like you get to have an off season and just be back in the district and focus. But there was so much going on. And the Florida Legislative Black Caucus continued to meet. Then we had the murder of George Floyd, and again, we just continued to meet. And we started thinking about what sort of legislative policies we'd want to put forward. We were meeting with folks in our community, meeting with law enforcement, meeting with each other, and trying to come up with or develop a policy platform. And so I was tapped to lead the effort to try to organize what we were doing in terms of our policy platform. And the way we approached it was to have every member of the caucus who wanted to file a piece of legislation related to police reform got to do that. And we did this in allyship with both the House and Senate Democratic caucuses and had some of those members file pieces of legislation as well. We rolled that out as a single platform, and that set the stage for negotiations with House and Senate leadership. And the result of those negotiations is House Bill 7051, the police reform bill. There are a number of great provisions in that bill. You heard me mention the duty to intervene. So the changes to basic training include now that officers will be trained on a duty to intervene. They'll be trained that they have a duty to render medical assistance. They'll be trained in the use of de-escalation techniques and limited use of chokeholds, which I think is a significant victory. It does other things, this bill. It establishes a minimum age of arrest in Florida, which is hard to imagine that we did not have one previously. It establishes a minimum age of arrest at 7. To me, that's something that we need to take another look at. We established it at 7. I think that it should be higher, perhaps 10. That's one of the reforms that we were pushing for. But again, it's a compromise bill. So you push, you give, and you take. So we have a minimum age of arrest now at 7 in the state of Florida, whereas previously we had none. And it was inspired by a young student she was 6 years old when she was arrested at her school in Orlando. So we do count getting a minimum age of arrest in law as a victory. It also provides greater accountability and transparency in the sense that any use of force that involves results in a death or the discharge of a firearm will now have to be reported to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement so that we can try to keep an eye on, if there's anything that looks like excessive use of force, that gets reported to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement database so that we can keep an eye on that. But if it's use of force that involves discharge of a firearm or results in death, that will require an independent review by an agency that is not involved in that use of force. So you either have to take that to another agency to have them review it, like the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or the state attorney, which is the prosecutor in a particular district, could review it. The good thing about having the prosecutor review it is that typically, I mean, prosecutors can actually do that right now, but typically they would review it by using a grand jury, and those proceedings would be out of the public eye and we wouldn't really know what happened. Now the state attorney would have to review it and would have to produce a report. Additionally, if an officer resigns or is terminated while under investigation and they try to go to a new employer, they have to provide an affidavit attesting to those facts and give that information to their new employer. So that way we help our sheriffs and our police chiefs preserve the good quality culture that they want in terms of maintaining, a commitment to public safety. So we're really excited about the bill. Like I mentioned, it was compromise, it was back and forth, it was a lot of negotiations, but at the end of the day, I think we cracked the door open to a really important conversation in Florida, and hopefully we can build on that and push for even more reforms in the future.
And Kara, you gotta admit, it's no small task, and that's why we charge Representative Driskell to be able to do it as the ultimate negotiator. She was able to get law enforcement on board, to get the Senate Democrats on board, the House Democrats on board, the House Republicans on board, the Senate Republicans on board, and to move this through in a process that usually doesn't happen like this for a Democratic-led bill. It went through, similar to another bill last year, went through one committee and made it to the floor, went through one committee in the House. Did it go through a committee on the House?
It did.
And then went to the floor. That shows you that this became a priority for the legislature. It was unanimous in the Senate. I think it was unanimous in the House too.
It was.
This type of work that we've had Representative Driskell leading. And when we worked on this at the caucus, as she said, we were meeting all through the summer. It was a very intense year because we were dealing with the pandemic, COVID-19, but then the pandemic on top of the pandemic. And we had a lot of members come together to make sure that we had this happen. And it's no small task, because she was actually in charge of corralling, if I can say that, all of the Black Caucus members and making sure that they filed their bills on the same day. And we held a press conference to make some noise about it. And ultimately, throughout the session period, we had a lot of conversation. But in the end, it was the work of the entire team finally getting it done, but the leadership of Rep. Driskell driving the charge, being the navigator. She was the navigator to get us to this final product. And it has opened the door. The conversations have been started. And not only are we, as the Florida Legislative Black Caucus, proud of the bill, but one of the things we've noticed, especially when we go back and do our legislative updates at home, my colleagues, our Republican members, are proud of this bill. When I say, session was probably one of the worst sessions last year, one of my Republican colleagues often says, "We passed police reform unanimously." And I have to remind him about all the other stuff we passed.
Excellent. Thank you. So yeah, Representative Driskell, you are going to have to explain how you were able to corral everybody and make that happen, because it seems like it's sort of a work of magic that you did. So can it be replicated again this session?
Well, I think, so first of all, thank you, Senator Powell, because that's very generous and very gracious of you. To your point, Kara, like, how did we do it? It starts at the top with leadership. So having a chair of the Florida Legislative Black Caucus that empowered me to be able to do this, that mattered, right? So Senator Powell set the direction, like, this is what we're going to do. This is our priority. That made it a lot easier for me to execute. I'm not saying it was easy to execute. I'm saying that helped in the sense that we had a singular focus and a singular direction that we were moving in. And that's really what it takes. And so I've seen the Black Caucus pull together on other issues, whether it was funding for historically Black colleges and universities, whether it's maternal and health disparities funding. So when we put our minds to it and we work together, we can accomplish this. I think what you'll see from the caucus this session, I mean, we're still refining our policy priorities, but I know that we've been talking quite a lot about community violence that's plaguing the Black community, and some other issues, economic development, and some of the things that we want to see in terms of uplift in the Black community. So yeah, I have no doubt that we could, if we put our minds to it and there was additional reforms that we wanted with respect to police reform, that we could accomplish this. The other thing that I want to mention, though, is that even though we were able to accomplish this last session, these are conversations that have been going on for years. Like, some of these bills have been filed repeatedly. I think last session we were able to catch lightning in a bottle, in a way, if you will, because we had the confluence of all of these factors, whether it was, the pandemic, so people are staying at home. And so everybody sees the video of George Floyd, and we're all super stressed and super sensitive. So seeing, horrific images like that, I think caused everybody, and by everybody, I mean my fellow lawmakers, my colleagues, called all of us to come to Tallahassee and wanting to do something on police reform. So it really was a special moment, which is probably going to be very difficult to duplicate that with all of those factors. But just the sense of us working together and being singularly focused to move the ball forward, absolutely, we can continue to do that. And even if it's just incremental change, we got to keep pushing for it. I mean, we got to keep knocking at the door. We have to keep knocking at the door. Our community demands it of it, and so we can't let up.
We are so grateful for both of you and for all the work you do every day and on that bill. Thank you so much. Do you know the status of any of the reforms that were implemented? I know there was like a bunch that you went through. Do we know, I know the bill had an implementation date, but in terms of whether or not any of those have started or any places that are working on them, the training that you talked about, do you have any information on that?
I don't, but that's a really great question. It makes me want to follow up to find out. I know that with the basic training piece, that does not go into effect until 2023, which is kind of, it feels very far down the road. But the thing of it is that we have a Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission that has to come up with a new curriculum and then implement it. And there's a lot of kind of bureaucracy that takes place behind the scenes. Unfortunately, with these changes, it's not like just flipping a switch and automatically they're in place. There are a lot of other areas of the law, and I think even just administratively, a lot of different rules and regulations that it touches on, which is why making these sort of significant changes is going to take some time. But you know what? I love that idea, and be happy to check in with them to see what's going on, if we've got any movement so far.
Yeah. And unfortunately, no, while the bill has taken effect in July of 2021, 7051 reviewed and revised significant portions of over 10 sections of law. And this amended statute within criminal procedures and corrections. So the Department of Law Enforcement chapters have created, I think it's chapter 985-31 of the Florida statutes, which was related to the age of arrest. It will take, of course, multiple agencies throughout the state to look at how that's being impacted and what's been the impact of that. And then you've also got to take into account, because of the different agencies involved, we've got the Department of Corrections, FDLE, Department of Juvenile Justice, that were all impacted by this legislation. So having the ability to kind of monitor and see what the impact has been will be a comprehensive process that will probably take a little bit more than a year. It took us more than a year to get into the, I'm not gonna say a mess, but into the situation that we were in. So I would imagine that we can start trying to review and see what has been impacted and where the impact has been held. But I also believe that on the grand scheme of things, it'll take a little bit more time for us to be able to really see the significant impact that we know there will be and is on the way because of this very, very important legislation.
Fabulous. Yeah. So we look forward to seeing the outcomes. I know it does take a long time, particularly the data collection piece, but we know that these are going to be incredibly helpful for everything going forward. So thank you. Can we talk a little bit about, what were the obstacles, right? So we know that there's generally the overall obstacles, but kind of more specifically, what types of things did you bump up against along the way, and what lessons are learned from that?
I will say that actually the biggest obstacle was time, in the sense that in Florida, we're in legislative session only for 60 days. So by the time we rolled out our policy platform, it was relatively early in session. But at that point, you only have so many weeks for bills to be heard in committee. And it just seemed like we were running out of time. It seemed like we were always up against the clock, Senator Powell. And so in the end, what you saw was a committee bill that came out, which committee bills don't have to adhere to the filing deadlines for legislation. And so I'm, we worked it very hard. We had a well thought out plan and we executed that plan, but you cannot account for, just the timing of things. And so I was very nervous that perhaps we might not have been able to get anything done last session. But to his credit, Speaker Sprouse over here in the Florida House made a commitment that we would be able to do something, and he kept his word. And so we kept working it, and then finally had the committee bill that was released, I want to say with maybe just a week, maybe a little more than a week to go in legislative session. So a couple weeks, I think, before we were done. So that was one of the biggest hurdles. But I think, typically, you have big ideas for legislation and some pass and some don't, and you wonder what's the difference. There has to be an appetite to do it. And so having Speaker Sprouse committed to making sure that we left this session with some sort of police reform was huge, because then that kind of trickled down to his committee chairs as well, and then to his leadership team, and then to his caucus, which made it much easier for our caucus to work with them. So I would say that time was really the biggest hurdle.
I would absolutely have to agree with that, Kara. I think when you combine the effort of putting over 45 pieces of legislation together with 27 members of the Florida Legislative Black Caucus and Rep. Driskell working to kind of corral this, and us putting our heads together to whittle it down to seeing what will stay and what will be impacted, and trying to push all of this through to finally get one product. It really was a matter of trying to figure out how to make it work in the time that we had allotted. And I had conversations with the Senate president here, and he was even concerned about the time. But one of the things we were able to do is come up with a streamlined bill using all of the stakeholders who were involved, and being able to work with not only the leadership in the Democratic caucus, both in the House and the Senate, but being able to work with the leadership, as you heard Rep. Driskell say, and the Speaker of the House, as well as the Senate President, to make this a priority. And that's why I was able to pass unanimously. So you watched Rep. Driskell at her finest in terms of kicking down those obstacles that they tried to place in our way. And truly, really, you have 27 members of a Black caucus, and each of us was rowing the boat in the same direction. Each of us, for the most part, were going and asking the Speaker, Senate President, the chairman of committees, hey, what are you going to do with these bills? Are you going to hear our bills? Hey, are you going to hear? And it was consistent, stronger together. And when we all work together, we all win.
That is very, very encouraging, because I'm often discouraged by the legislative process and the fate of the criminal justice reforms and police reform bills. So hearing you both talk about that has made me a little bit more optimistic. So you talked about some of the key players. You mentioned Speaker Sprouse, Senate President Simpson. Can you talk a little bit about, if you want something to pass, who are the key players that you need to get on board, or it's just not going to go anywhere?
I'll tell you this. When it comes down to ultimately making sure things pass here in the legislature, you want to make sure that at the end, the Senate President and the Speaker of the House are able to live with those things. You also want to have somebody in the governor's office, which we did meet with the governor. We didn't talk about that, but we did meet with the governor and we discussed this as well. Myself, Rep. Driskell, and a delegation of leadership from the Florida Legislative Black Caucus. You want to make sure ultimately that the governor agrees with it because he's got the ultimate power of the veto pen. So at the end of the day, you want to make sure that all of the leaders in the state of Florida are able to get on board. But in order to get there first, you have to have buy-in from your members. And we were able to create that, have synergy moving forward. And guess what? We feel that, yes, the bill could have went farther, but we had to produce a product that got everyone on board. And it took that kind of work. So ultimately, it ends with the governor, Senate president, Speaker of the House. But in the preliminary stages, you have to have buy-in from your members at every level. And that means your senators and your state representatives who are working together to put together a product that we can all move forward with and take to leadership and say, this is where we're at. Because if you have all of your members together, that can persuade your Senate president, your Speaker of the House, your governor, who may not have been there, but they see the colleagues feeling moving in a certain direction, and it can help to get them there.
I think that's well said. I really don't have anything to add other than wanted to pick up on the point where Senator Powell was saying how the bill could have gone further. That's right. I mean, it's the nature of compromise. This very much is a piece of compromise legislation. And I think that House leadership was very clear to us from the beginning, right? Like, it's going to have to be give and take on both sides. And I think that's one of the things that actually makes me so proud about this bill is that this is how the process is supposed to work. It's not supposed to be that, just one person or party or whatever has all the best ideas and all the right ideas. We represent different constituencies from all across the state and folks who are all across the political spectrum. So what can we do to try to meet in the middle and really try to focus on the common sense issues that are going to get things done? Because I think that's what the public sends us here to do. They expect us to get the job done. They expect us to take our job seriously and to work and move forward and to make progress. So that's one of the elements that I'm really proud about with this bill. So I just wanted to lift that up. And then also in terms of, because I think the question was, who do you need to get buy-in from to get it passed? That's absolutely right. I will also say that it is really helpful. It's an encouragement to us to have the support of allied groups like the ACLU, who can help share with their membership and with their constituencies what we're working on and build up that public support, because sometimes that can be helpful too in kind of tilting the scales in the way that we need to move legislation forward. So thanks for all that you do.
Thank you. We are always happy to support. In terms of some other key players, I don't know if you tell me if they're key players. What role does the Sheriff's Association have, the police chiefs, FDOC, Florida Department of Corrections, or state attorneys have in whether bills move forward in the process, whether they pass, whether they ultimately fail?
I would say absolutely a huge stake, right? Those are the key stakeholders. In addition to the community who is impacted by the bill, you certainly want to have the officers at the table who would be impacted by the bill. So like I mentioned, from very early on in the summertime, even before we were scheduled to come back or due to come back to Tallahassee, our members were meeting with law enforcement in their respective communities. And then once we got to the place of actually talking about concepts for bills, we had meetings with the Sheriff's Association, the Police Benevolence Association, Police Chiefs Association, you name it. We wanted to meet with them and get their input so that we made sure that we were taking into account their perspectives as well. Because what you don't want to do is have really good ideas, but not have done the adequate legwork so that it gets so, if it gets too far down the line and there are those who could say, well, wait a minute, you didn't think about X, Y, or Z, it would absolutely kill our bill and all of our hard work that we've been putting in for months. So it was critical to get those voices and have their input, and to make sure that we focused on that early on and throughout the entire process. I really do think that that helped make a difference in this. I mean, would you agree, Senator Powell, about how we engage law enforcement on this also?
Absolutely. I would agree. The problem of the legislature is we are a body of many different professions, and a lot of times we're making decisions based on issues that we don't deal with on a day-to-day basis. We've got attorneys, we've got a couple of teachers, we do have maybe one or two law enforcement officers. I'm an urban planner, the only one in the legislature who does that. But we make decisions based on all kinds of things, plumbing, construction, and sometimes what we lack is technical expertise in that particular area. So those entities, they do play a key role of providing technical expertise and hands-on experience from a law enforcement and legal standpoint. So they can also attest to the fiscal impacts that a bill may have, and how in which the law will be used or enforced. Even after the bill has been passed and completed, these individuals still play the role of effectively putting it in place and communicating and executing this new law and new language to the general public, and communicating that in a way, because they're out there doing it on a daily basis. So that's why it was important to take everyone's perspective into account, so that we're able to move forward on one accord. And the police chiefs associations, the sheriff's associations, the prosecutors associations, all of the different entities that we work with did not feel that the legislature was mandating something on them without taking their voices into account. And that's why it was important for the sheriff's association and the police chiefs and Department of Corrections and the state's attorneys, and all of those different stakeholder groups to have a say-so in drafting this very, very important piece of legislation.
Great, thank you. So you've talked a little bit about, how it was a compromise bill, and how there were things that you would have done differently if it was just the Senator Powell and Rep. Driskell bill. But so what are those things that were left on the table? What reforms didn't make it into the bill that are still things that you hope to continue working on?
Wow. Well, like we mentioned, we had 27 members and most of them filed pieces of legislation. So there was quite a lot that was left out of the bill. So I think those pieces of legislation, though, and those policy concepts really give us points with which to engage going forward. So one that I mentioned previously was the minimum age of arrest. So in the bill, that is at 7 years of age, but I would like to revisit that conversation to see if we can get that nudged higher. I think that's a great deal of trauma to visit upon our youngest students and kids who may not really understand the consequences of their actions. Could other de-escalation techniques be used so that we're not arresting our babies and scarring them for life? I would love to see that be revisited. I think something else that we talked about was just really trying to think through the accountability piece that's with the bill. So, for example, if an officer fails to properly execute that duty to intervene, then what happens? The bill kind of stops at that place of making it a requirement. And I think it leaves great latitude and discretion to our police chiefs and sheriffs, which they should have, to determine what sort of a culture that they want in their agency. But I think we could even have conversations about what we would like to see that form of accountability look like. Certainly requiring the affidavit for officers who are moving from agency to agency is a good step of something like what we mean with accountability, right? Like you can't just leave a mess at your prior agency and go to a new one and think that you're not going to disclose that you left a mess. So that was a good piece in the legislation where we were able to follow through and say what that accountability should look like. But I think there might be room to have more conversations about what that should be. You also heard us mention body cameras before. So it's not just having the access to the body cameras, which in and of itself is an important issue. We know that there are jurisdictions that just don't have the resources to acquire them. They can be very expensive for an agency. But where I would also like to see that conversation go, for the agencies that do have body cameras and use them, what are the best practices and what are kind of like the minimum standards that they should be using or applying whenever they're using body cameras in terms of how long they keep that footage? What happens to an officer if the camera is off at a time when it should be on? In addition, what are the parameters for when that footage can be released to the public? I think those are important issues that we need to look into. Just to kind of put a finer point on that, it's not just about having the body cameras, which I think in and of itself is really important and something that we should aspire to in Florida, to have as many agencies as possible be able to have them. And if they can't afford them, I would like to see the state, try to help, maybe provide some grant funding to the agencies that can't afford them. But for those that do, what are the policies and procedures? I think that's something that we could also look at.
Sorry, did you want me to continue with that question?
If you had other things to add, otherwise I will move on.
No, I think she did an outstanding job.
Sounds like you both have your work cut out for you. So I'd like to move us on a little bit to talk about criminal justice reform. We've talked a lot about policing reform efforts, and I want to make sure that we are able to cover some criminal justice reform efforts as well. One of the reforms that the ACLU and several allied partners have been working on for years is increasing the amount of rehabilitation credits that an individual can earn off of their sentence. And this increase in the rehabilitation credits would come through educational programming, vocational programming, any type of programming that an individual participates in during their time of incarceration so that they are able to rehabilitate themselves and earn time off their sentence. There were bills that were filed last session and the session before. They moved in the Senate, but did not move in the House. And so I guess let's start with the House. Do you think there's any appetite to have these rehabilitation credit bills move in the House this session?
Well, I think that now is a great time to have the conversation and to maybe approach it in a fresh way. We commonly refer to this as gain time. It's the gain time bills. And the thing of it is, and I know Senator Powell has carried this legislation before, so he can talk about it, but it would save the state close to $1 billion over 5 years. It's like $860 billion, right? 860 million, sorry. So that's close to $1 billion over the course of 5 years. I think in the time of COVID-19, where we saw our budget suffer, we would not have had adequate resources to fund everything in the budget had it not been for President Joe Biden and the American Rescue Plan, American Rescue Act, and the CARES Act, like the American Rescue Plan and the CARES Act. Florida's budget, the largest that I'd ever seen it, was at around $93 billion. In the 2020 legislative session, we were facing a shortfall, I want to say, of close to $9 billion or so. With the American Rescue Plan dollars, we passed a budget of around $101.5 billion. So we absolutely were saved by that plan and that infusion of money from the federal government. We won't be able to count on that every legislative session. And as Florida's population grows, as we have greater infrastructure needs, whether you're talking about our roads, whether you're talking about our public schools, whether you're talking about our aging population who needs care per capita, we have, I think, the most seniors in the nation. When you talk about those very real needs, climate change and the resiliency needs that we have, for needs for clean water, we have to be able to pay for that. So when you can take a policy like this that is cost neutral in the sense that it won't cost the state more money to implement this, it actually will save the state dollars. We need to be having that conversation. And I think we need to be talking about this, not just in terms of criminal justice reform, which is very important, but also the business case for why it makes sense to approach this in a common sense way so that we can really, have the resources that we need to fund, all of this growth that we have in Florida.
I absolutely agree with that. And on top of that, I've got the unique experience of myself with a few members of the legislature walking into some of these prisons and talking to the inmates and hearing the excitement in their voices about the potential to reduce that 85% gain time to 65%. There's absolutely been an appetite in the Senate to make it happen. I think last year it was actually carried by Senator Keith Perry, and I was helping to push it in conversation and leadership and talking and rolling. And I think there's going to be movement again this year. We may not get to 65%, but if we can go from have individuals having to serve 85 to maybe even 75%, you get a big window. We have to remember this, because I've had conversations with people who are currently inmates who are looking forward to the day they come home, because they've been there a long time and eventually they will come home, right? Brian Stevenson said it best. No one is the worst thing that they've ever done. We have a tendency to look at people who are behind bars and immediately say, this person is a criminal, this person's a bad person. But how many of us have had family members who got involved in a situation that are not bad people, right? Everybody who ends up incarcerated is not a bad person. And sometimes if they had a bad day, a person should not be judged for the rest of his or her life based on a bad day. And unfortunately, that's what we've done. And incarceration is not just a sentence for them while they're there, even if they serve the 85% of the time with good behavior. It's a life sentence when they come out, because they're continuously judged based on something that they may have or may not have, depending on what type of representation they had in done for the rest of their lives. And the disproportionate portion about it is sometimes people who have done things worse were never incarcerated because either they were never prosecuted or they were never caught. And those same people have the ability to judge others who have been incarcerated and say, that's a bad person because he served time, right? So we also see right now we're closing a couple of facilities in the Florida system. That's going to save money, but imagine how much money we could save with police reform, with corrections. Nobody gets corrected when you send them into the Department of Corrections. But if we did start correcting people, the impact that it would have on our economy in a better way. Just think about those things. So we're going to be pushing, we will be pushing that legislation again this year. I'm not sure if Keith Perry has filed it or if it will be something that I will work on, but I know in the House, Rep. Hart has been filing it, and she's been very passionate and committed. Remember, there's nothing more powerful than the passionate, committed mind. So sometimes, Kara, when you talk from the standpoint of the ACLU, you, like us, myself and Rep. Driskell, we're in this battle as not only Democrats in the process, African American, Black Democrats in the process, women in the process, not me, but Rep. Driskell. It's just the things that you have to go against. But guess what? Nothing is more powerful than the passionate, committed mind. And when you keep going after it, you're going to hear some no's. You're going to hear a lot of no's, but eventually you will get there. We talked about direct file earlier. That's something I had been working on prior to me even being elected. My predecessor, who I worked for as an aide, was filing direct file legislation, and I followed in his footsteps through the House and through the Senate, and we've made some significant changes and impact there.
Could I just add one thing, Senator Powell, because your response inspired me. This is also about achieving the goals of the criminal justice system. And we have a moral obligation there as well. And that moral obligation is to provide for the rehabilitation of those who process through our system. So the gain time system, or if we're talking about the rehabilitation credits, it's something that the individuals who are in prison have to earn, right? Like they earn this. They go to class, they do the right things, they demonstrate that they should not be judged by their worst day. So this is not by any means a handout. This is not by any means, trying to be soft on crime. This is trying to look at the most efficient and thoughtful ways to meet our moral obligation to provide people with that opportunity for a second chance. So there are very strong moral grounds for which we push for this. And it's one of these policies where the state can do well while doing good. It is absolutely a win-win-win for the state, for the people who are caught up in the system, and for our families. So we have to keep pushing with this idea with the passion that you said, because you're absolutely right. It's something worthwhile being committed to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I could not have said it better myself. The win-win here is unbelievable because, like you said, it saves close to $1 billion, right? So it is a cost savings, or tremendous cost savings to the state and to taxpayers. And the result of it is that people who are incarcerated will be better able to participate in society productively once they're released. So it sort of just helps everybody. But for some reason, there seems to be not as much of an appetite in the House, at least, than the Senate, and really hope that changes. I'd like to move on to talking about children and the impact of children, the impact on children when their primary caregiver is sentenced and incarcerated, and the fact that our current criminal justice system does not take into account the impact on children when their primary caregiver is incarcerated. So we have a situation that leaves children vulnerable to abuse by other people if they don't have their primary caregiver in the home anymore to care for them. And I wanted to hear from you both about whether you think there is appetite for that type of legislation, basically allowing judges to have the discretion to consider the impact on minor children before they sentence defendants.
For me, I absolutely believe judges should have some type of discretion with regard to sentencing of primary caregivers. Former representative, now county commissioner down in Dade County, Keone McGee, is a part of a project where children of inmates are reconnected with their parents. I can't think of the name of the program right now, but how powerful, right? I have lived in an era where so many young people have been disproportionately disconnected from their parents, not just as their primary caregiver, but also as a figure in their lives that has impacted them tremendously to this day. This is a situation where at times children end up living with their grandparents and become available as an opportunity to be abused by other family members because their parent is no longer in the picture, or their parents are not in the picture. And that has to be something that we really, really take into account for, and how judges should have the discretion to deal with those particular issues, because at this point, it's not just the impact, and people have to understand this, it's not just the impact on that person who's being incarcerated. Children whose parents are incarcerated are also serving time, right? And that impacts them tremendously, even after relationships have changed. For me, I'll talk about me. My father got into some trouble while I was elected. Go figure, right? I was an adult and he was in his late 60s. And for the first time, in my life, right? I couldn't put my hands on him when I wanted to. I could not talk to him when I wanted to. I could not see him when I wanted to. And I was in my 30s at the time. So I could not even imagine being, we talk about it as an abstract concept because maybe we've grown up with our parents. But to be a child who is not fully developed and to not be able to have the ability to connect with your parent or your parents because either one or both of them are incarcerated, and the impact that has on them psychologically when attending school, the impact that has on them when participating in extra or other curricular type activities. So I know I'm going, and I put so much into it and even talked about myself, but yes, judges should have discretion.
Well, you're right, Senator Powell. I believe every Floridian deserves the freedom to be healthy, prosperous, and safe. And that certainly must include those among us who are the most vulnerable. So whether we're talking about children or we're talking about elderly dependents, we know that these are populations that are susceptible to abuse. We also know that it makes sense to give our judges discretion, right? Like we know that mandatory minimums don't work. There's so many examples of rigid guidelines and protocols in the law that tie a judge's hands when it's the judge, he or she or they are, there, and they can actually see the parties, they can see and hear from the families, they can understand what's happening, they can strike that appropriate balance, in other words, between the goals of the criminal justice system, whether it's, looking at rehabilitation, looking at the punishment piece, looking at all and accountability, looking at all of those elements and trying to, tailor a sentence that might make sense and take into account all of those different factors. Whereas we here in Tallahassee are trying to make that as an academic judgment before the thing ever happens, and we're not presented with the particular facts or circumstances. So I absolutely think that the ACLU is right to raise this issue as something that's important and that needs a legislative solution.
Thank you both so much. And thank you for mentioning the elderly individuals as well, because that is another piece of this legislation that we're thinking about, that it would take into consideration the impact of on children and also elderly adults when the primary caregiver is incarcerated. And thank you, Senator Powell, for sharing your experience and thinking about what it is like for a child, even when you had that experience as an adult, just brings it all home so much more. So thank you. We are close to time. I could talk to you guys all day about criminal justice reform, and I hope to do that every day from now on to the rest of the legislative session. But Kat is going to join us to have a couple minutes to ask a couple questions from the audience that have been collected. And I don't get to see you again. I'm going to stay on, but I won't get to say goodbye after. But I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a pleasure talking with both of you, and I look forward to speaking with you probably tomorrow. Thank you. Kat, take it away.
Alrighty, yes, I definitely echo Kara's statement. It was a great conversation, and I'm glad that we're able to have it. And so with the time that we have left, we're going to take a few questions that were dropped in the chat box on Facebook as well as on YouTube. I'm going to read out the question. Whoever feels comfortable to answer, you can take it away. So the first question was, a lot of grassroots reform efforts run into difficulties with police union contracts. Do the bills you are proposing / supporting address these contracts in any way?
I'll tell you that one of the pieces of legislation that our Black Caucus members put forward would have looked into the issue of police union contracts. We were not able to get any traction with that. And I'm happy to answer these quickly or have Senator Powell do it, one at a time so we can get through as many questions as possible.
Sounds good. Senator Powell, anything to add?
No.
All right, sounds good. The next question, conditions in the Department of Corrections are dire. How can we have people in conditions that are not habitable for humans?
One of the issues there is, we've got to continue to, it's a double-edged sword. You have to fund your prisons to make sure that we've got the facilities that they need, air conditioning, pest control, the ability to have clean and healthy facilities, but we also have the other part where we have to fund corrections so that we're not sending so many people to these institutions. And as you know, we talked about this earlier, that's why we have two that have closed. So we've got to really work on that. But the biggest thing we can do is to make sure that we reduce those numbers. Over 95,000 people inside of our prisons here in the state of Florida. We've got to get those numbers down. And we do that by doing things like sentencing reform. We talked about gain time, and those types of things can allow us to release the stress on the system as it is today, because we'd much rather be spending money to educate our minds and educate the minds of the children before having to spend money to incarcerate people.
What I will add to that just very briefly is that what we need to watch out for as well is increased privatization of these prisons. I'm afraid that is what is coming down the pike. So everyone who is watching, please stay vigilant, pay attention. If this happens, we'll make sure that we sound the alarm. That the ACLU will be on top of it as well, but we may need your voices to stand against any such bad proposals.
Of course. Another question that we have is, what criminal justice bills do you plan to sponsor or co-sponsor this session?
I'll tell you that I co-sponsored one today, House Bill 257, and it's a really good bill. And I'm trying to remember exactly what it does because we see so many really good bills. But this is one, it does something with youth. Why can't I remember this? Kara, do you remember which bill that is?
I think that might be the juvenile, the fines and fees one. Is that?
Oh yeah, thank you. Sorry, just drew a blank. Right. So what happens in the criminal justice system is that criminal defendants are charged fines and fees. And this makes it very difficult for them. Let's say they work through the process and then they want to get a job and they got all these fines and fees and then they miss a payment and then their license gets suspended and it creates this whole big spiral, this big debt spiral. Well, the criminal justice system, we're also charging kids fines and fees. Kids don't have a job. They don't have a way to pay that. So they really don't have, it's really not anything that's even collectible, but it trails our youth for far too long. So I've co-sponsored legislation that would eliminate the charging of fines and fees of our youth who are caught up in the criminal justice system. And then my office is still working on refining our policy legislative platform. In the House, we only get 7 bill slots each session. So far, I filed 1 bill, and so I'm trying to process through what the other 6 will be. But I'll be sure to let the ACLU know.
I want to thank you for asking that same question. For me, we are working on several things. One is always looking at how we can once again impact direct file of our juveniles. Another that we're working on with one of the representatives, Matt Wilhite, is when individuals get out of jail or prison, I say jail, prison, and they are given a check, that if they want to go cash those checks, they don't have fees taken out from the institution that they're taking them from. I believe Rep. Mike Caruso and I will be working on legislation to eliminate, I think, some minor instances where someone is caught with marijuana, or I need to look at that bill that we filed again to work on that. Just ways that we can have an impact as the world continues to evolve. We can get rid of some of these antiquated laws that have changed with the times.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, I think those both sound great. And so, yeah, thank you for the work that you're doing. And then one last question. Fixing the system now is good for the future, but what about those in the system already? And
Well,
so
I think that's where funding really comes into play as well, right? Like what Senator Powell was talking about, and it speaks to the question from the audience earlier, how can we have people in living situations that are not inhabitable? I mean, we need to think about our moral obligation as a society to do right by those who would be considered otherwise the least among us. The folks who are in prisons right now and in our jails, they are human too, and they have human rights and they deserve to be treated with dignity. I mean, there's legislation that I've been honored to support, and I know Senator Powell has supported it. It was even the Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act, where we made sure that, I think it was with the leadership of Senator Chevron Jones, to make sure that our women who are in the criminal justice system get access to basic feminine hygiene products. It sounds unconscionable to think that they didn't have it before, but that's just one example of where, as legislators, we can jump in and help, and do try to help to make conditions better for those who are in the system even now.
Thank you. And with that, I want to say thank you so much to you both for being here with us tonight, for answering this question, for giving us some insight on police reform as well as criminal justice reform. I know that I learned a lot, and I hope that those viewing now and whoever will watch the broadcast will be able to learn something too in the next coming days. Thank you so much to our audience for being here with us tonight and for asking these great questions. If you are interested in learning more about what the ACLU is doing when it comes to criminal justice reform, you are free to join us, and you can actually email me directly if you'd like more information. If you weren't here in the beginning, I am an organizer, one of 2 organizers for criminal justice reform, and so this is an issue that is extremely important to the ACLU. And so if you're interested in getting more information or in joining the fight for criminal justice reform, please send me an email. And with that, thank you again and good night.
Good night. Thank you.